No, I thought this was really interesting. Sam Harris was on Russell Brand's show. I'm a big fan of Russell Brand. And, there's one thing in here that I actually disagree with Brand with that I think we can position differently. But it was great. I mean, Russell Brand treated him very, very respectfully. As with most of these conversations, I don't know how much happened. I think everybody left. The Harris people left thinking, there's clear thinking and Brand's a postmodernist, and the Brand people thought.
I saw one video that Sam Harris schools Russell Brand on consciousness, and I'm like, I listened to that whole thing, and I didn't really hear that.
Yeah, but right. I listened to it, and I heard funny Messiah complex guy attempts to get Sam Harris to become more fully human. But let's play this clip. It's worth checking out how Brand handled this.
My general feeling is that the Quran holy is like most religious scripture. The intention is to create a social environment where people are benevolent and cohesive, which ultimately became a tool for social control as a result of the way the power structures.
But there's more to that. There's life
within
after death.
Religion
there's
and politics. But I don't know. I think again that, I wouldn't deliberately misread the metaphor. For me, life after death, and this is a person that spent 2 years in a silent retreat, I would gather you would dig this, is that beyond the life that is determined by primal desires and biographical wants and your imagination of yourself, there is a life after the death of that individual. After that individual dies and you recognise that the temporal can never provide fulfilment, you gain access to a sort of a second life, an afterlife. The kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth and man sees it not. The kingdom of heaven
Are you talking about the life after the death of your ego?
I suppose so, Sam. Yes. I would say, if it's not talking about that, I don't know what it's talking about. And what the value of that would be.
But that's fine. But
as a manual for being human. Also, Sam, there's so much, mate. Let me hold on a sec. Because we've got to go through. You did a big classification system of the degrees of who's the worst madman.
I just want to put a flag right here.
We've got to do the schools.
Okay, well, we'll do that.
Do your flag, and then we're going back to the schools.
I just want to acknowledge that whatever
my personal reading,
whatever your reading is, most people, most of the time, think that the afterlife is a literal place you go after you die. That consciousness survives the death of the body. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition,
I know,
especially the Christian,
mate.
and the Islamic tradition, it really matters whether you believe the right thing or not. I mean, in fact, this life doesn't matter at all, and that's what's so corrosive about this belief system.
But
I just wanted to pause it there because that is bullshit. I don't know where Sam Harris, what his spiritual life growing up was, but I remember when I was hadn't become agnostic atheist.
Right.
I did not feel that certain about heaven and hell at all. I wondered about that privately, and publicly I might say, yeah, I believe in heaven, but you never really it's never really that certain. I don't think.
Even the literal belief in those traditions is actually this life is almost like a testing or training ground that determines that. So there actually is a lot of weight put on that.
Really matters whether you believe the right thing or not. I mean, in fact, this life doesn't matter at all, and that's what's so corrosive about this belief system.
But but let's look at some of the alternatives. Now we just devised a barometer of degrees of madness and the worst types of madness and the worst way to have your kids murdered in a school by which particular type of madman. But we should probably bring into the mix from the sky by a drone. Because for me, I don't want my kids killed in a school for any ideology, whether it's grounded in sort of rationalism and economics, or whether it's a book that's a bit older and more, I don't know, esoteric or colourful or imaginative. I don't know sort of how to determine it. But what I suppose the heart of what I want to get to is, whilst undoubtedly religion has been used to justify violence from all types of angles in different historical moments, and Buddhist violence in Burma and Christian violence in in the Middle East, or secular violence underwritten by Christianity, resourced entirely from Christianity and sort of Christian dualistic notions,
right,
undertaken by far right Christian presidents and whatever, or sort of the more lucid, livid, and obvious and contemporaneous far right extremist Islamic violence. It's how do we see that as distinct from rational violence, political violence, particularly when that is far more potent, far more widespread, and is the violence of the dominant culture. What interests me, Sam Harris, is power and the powerful.
Okay.
And for me, I'm interested in who gets to decide who the other is, who gets to decide by what metric rationalism and religion is evaluated. And it seems to me that the kind of violence that's focused on in a lot of your work is the violence of desperate people desperate and possibly subjugated people. And I would say I know that you don't do this, but I want you to educate me on this. But to dismiss the colonial aspect, the sort of economic aspect, the occupation of Middle Eastern countries, the historical aspect. I mean, for me, it seems like how can you conduct that extraction? How can you divorce those different types of violence? They seem to me to be part of one narrative.
Well, I can do it very simply because you have examples, just to dissect out the variable of colonialism or oppression from the outside. You have examples of people who have been oppressed, as oppressed as any other people who don't resort to this kind of violence because they don't have the same belief structure, right? So here's an almost perfect scientific experiment. You have Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims living in the same occupied territories, right? Now, who was before the Israelis put up the wall, who was blowing themselves up in pizza parlors and discotheques, right? It was 99.9% Muslim, right? It was not Christian.
Now, I don't know if Harris is doing this consciously to talk about modern intifada and the recent outbreak of terrorism. But if you look at even a broader historical context, the historical pioneer of Palestinian terror was a guy named George Habash, who was connected with Marxist-Leninist groups, Black September, and was in fact a Christian. He was a Greek Orthodox Christian and a Palestinian guerrilla movement leader, and absolutely we could fairly call him a terrorist because he did advocate targeting civilians. So even the Palestinian example is a lot more historically muddied than Harris would like to think. Now, we could go and point out all of the various sort of contradictions to this, right? There's the kamikaze pilots. There's the fact that the Tamil Tigers pioneered suicide bombing, so on and so forth. And this is where Harris really loses it, because you could still have a very conservative reading that was, still wanted to primarily place the blame elsewhere, not on U.S. or Western actions. If you go back to the 80s, and the funding that the Pakistanis and the Saudis chose, and they chose to funnel into the most radical parts of the Mujahideen. There's a story in a book called Beating the Bear, which was written by a former Pakistani ISI official who helped run the Mujahideen for the Pakistani intelligence services. And they tell the story of a Mujahideen operation that the CIA and the Pakistanis wanted to do, where they would blow up a major bridge that was a vital link for Soviets running supplies into Afghanistan for their occupying forces. At this point in the 80s, essentially that operation, in order to do, would be, by necessity, be a suicide operation. In other words, if they sent two guys in there to blow up this tunnel, rather, it wasn't a bridge, it was a tunnel, to blow it up, they would die. Not necessarily like on purpose, like they wouldn't be strapped with explosives, but it was a suicide run. They couldn't get anybody to do it at this point because suicide missions were considered so haram by the Mujahideen. So you could say the rise of this as a political tactic is not only connected to the political conditions. I mean, Palestine is a really shaky example to use because that actually is where Pape's work on humiliation, which Harris totally dismisses and doesn't really understand, comes most into play, because that is a literal ongoing subjugation and humiliation of another people through occupation. But if you go into a broader context of how it accelerated in these Sunni groups, you could look at what the prime Sunni power chose to fund. They chose to fund the most right-wing reactionary forces, and that facilitated the most right-wing reactionary tactics. Do you think if a Somali Sufi group, as an example, moderate, in fact, mystical form of Islam that has been fighting al-Shabaab in Somalia, that along with other groups in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, if those more moderate forces and different types of guerrilla groups receive the vast bulk of funding and their tactics dominated, we wouldn't have a completely different geopolitical understanding of Islamic tactics. At another point in that interview, Harris said that essentially, and I'm going to paraphrase, but that ideas are sort of the most powerful. And I think that is a kind of actually really charmingly, unbelievably naive view of how the world works. Ideas are an after effect, and ideas are allowed to flourish when the context allows them to flourish. Sometimes that context is organic. I think there is a tremendous interest in things like Marxism now because of economic and material conditions. But there's also simply the reality that different systems allow for different ideologies to flourish at different times. And if you combine the failures of nationalist and left projects in the 70s, the rise of global religious fundamentalism filtered through things like Saudi and Pakistani foreign policy, you have a much better grip on why this current thing is manifesting. And by the way, we on our side can easily, and the last thing I'll say, I want you guys to jump in. The last thing I'll say is Russell Brand is totally right about this stuff, and we can easily in a conversation acknowledge obvious things like, yes, the Taliban was horrible to women. Yes, there is fundamentalist and fanatical religion and religious regimes that abuse people's rights across the globe. Yes, readings of Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism are toxic. And maybe even I would accept that probably Christianity, Islam, and Judaism might have more, they're less innately herbivorous than Buddhist or Jain doctrines, right? But if you don't historicize and you don't economize things, you're in a fantasy universe that leads either to a nice version that Harris criticizes, which is a sort of a sort of equal playing field where you're not making important distinctions, or in his case, where everything is these ahistorical quotes, which you can use to forward destructive and dangerous policy ideas, or at this point, it seems like since he primarily shies away from policy, just sort of hammering home the fact that he doesn't like Islam. The productivity of this for the broader debates about everything from human rights to migration to foreign policy to the evolving nature of democracy is utterly mystifying to me. Please jump in, guys.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that it's it's a really juvenile idealist belief that Harris advocates. Right. I mean that idealist in the fact that he thinks that like ideas, are driving the world rather than material conditions.
Right.
I mean, the end result of a lot of the arguments that Harris is making is that, if you just sent in, let's say, 222-year-olds fresh from college from America into Iran, it would fundamentally change the politics of that country.
Right.
It's like, no, Iran is the way that it is, and the Islamic Revolution happened there because of outside and interior like material issues. And it's this kind of idea that if we just critique Islam enough, that like the rest of the world is going to change or become this new thing. It's wrong, and it's naive, and it's ahistorical.
Right.
And it's incredible that somebody like Harris has been able to make a career based on this, because fundamentally what he's trying to do is he's trying to bring up the terror and the horror of theocratic regimes as an excuse for the terror and the horror of capitalist, neoliberal, and imperialist regimes. So it's a really, what else can I say? He's a charlatan.
Don't come I've read the quotes. I've read the Quran. I studied Islam. Okay, I get it. You coming at me and saying you're ignoring the hadith and da da da. What you don't understand is you think that we're pre-Harris in sophistication. We're post. Okay, you're having a juvenile conversation. I'm trying to actually get to a point of understanding this stuff, not to be politically correct and nice to Muslims, blah, 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 though I don't think being...
That's all I'm in it for.
Yeah. I mean, God forbid having like civility and respect in general. The same thing that... And by the way, the last point I'll make, they talk about double standards that liberals have. I have the same argument about Christianity. I don't agree with blanking statements about Christianity. Christianity manifests in many, many different ways, depending on geopolitical, historical, social context, and has been a force for tremendous good. Tremendous good. And I don't appreciate lazy liberal categorizations about Christianity either. If you go to a more classical atheist tradition of like people who actually really read and understood this stuff, they understood, they might have been utterly appalled by all of the damage that religion has sort of inflicted on society, but they were sophisticated enough to know that it played a tremendously serious role. And if you really think that just being like 15 and discovering that a fairy tale isn't true is the be-all end-all of the game, I mean, okay, congratulations. Yes, creationism is not real. Nailed it. And people will watch this and they'll say, Russell Brand's being a relativist. Russell Brand he is the one, the dude with the Ganesha tattoo, my man meditating with the expanded global consciousness, is the one materializing the conversation and elevating it in a synchronized way.
I'd just like to play this one part over again, just because I think it points to something I think important.
Yeah, please.
Extremist Islamic violence. It's like, how do we see that as distinct from rational violence, political violence, particularly when that is far more potent, far more widespread, and I would say, is the violence of the dominant culture. What interests me, Sam Harris, is power and the powerful.
Okay.
And for me, I'm interested in who gets the.
Okay, so that that Sam Harris did when Russell Brand says he's interested in power, the thing Sam Harris likes to say about ideas is that they're powerful. So he's interested in how words are powerful, but he's not interested at all in actual power.
That there has never been an analysis that he has started. And that's why the other thing, too, in his sort of game to be aware of is that if you talk about just a basic asymmetry of power, so let's concede the United States, for all of its global crimes of empire, which I don't know if Harris is fully familiar with, but is real.
He says he knows about them, but
Okay, but whatever. I'll try to take him at his word. I can still say, yes, there's no doubt that it is an on-the-ground experience. The barbarism of ISIS totally outweighs the United States. So the global crime toll of the United States is infinitely bigger than ISIS. On the ground, yes. U.S. troops, throwing people off buildings, burning people alive, raping children is not part of coin strategy, okay? We have evolved on some level, right? But the bigger structural reality is that ISIS is a speck compared to our presence in the world. So if you want to understand geopolitics, you have to go to the engines that are actually driving geopolitics. Harris's move then is he goes, okay, I understand that, but what if ISIS controlled the world? There's a thought experiment. And then you're off to the races in mental masturbation instead of reality discussion. It's very revealing. And I honestly mean this. If you're a fan of his and you have a resource that you could point me to correct me on this, I've searched far and wide for any type of sustained Harris commentary on the Iran nuclear deal, because that is the closest to a real-world non-thought experiment fantasy example of where all of this thinking, if we want to call it that, goes, which is that, okay, supposedly the Islamic Republic is this fanatic Muslim state, although it's really not. It's actually a very realist-oriented actor, if you understand it. But I'll even set that aside. Say it's a fundamentalist fanatic Muslim state. It has the ability technologically to acquire a nuclear weapon, which, as Sam Harris has said in one of his previous thought of experiments, might, and again, I'm sure out of context, but it might, I think we can at least fairly say it might justify a preemptive attack if an Islamic regime had that capacity because they're apocalyptic. So out of the realm of all of this verbiage and thought experimenting and divorce from politics, this is a real world example. This supposed serious hardcore Islamic state, which absolutely, by the way, if we're going to drag those other issues in, violates human rights at home, supports foreign policy goals that actually in Syria we're synchronized with in some ways, and other ways we don't like. That deal has worked 100%. There is no credible person, like no serious person in the realm, including people like Tillerson has been signing off on this and getting Trump to sign off on those reauthorizations every couple of months. There is nobody, and anybody in the policy apparatus who tries to undermine that deal tries to do it by doing side poison pills that aren't in the deal. There is no one in the policymaking world, in the energy world, who says that deal isn't happening. So, cool. I'll do a trade with Sam Harris. I will do one thought experiment for 3 actually occurring examples of things happening in the terrestrial plane that, by the way, don't just involve Palestinian suicide bombers or random examples of Islamic terrorism. I'm going to want 2 or 3 actual real-world occurring historical events and foreign policy challenges now. And actually, no, I'll be fair. I'll go 3-3, thought experiment wise. But just notice that tactic. Okay, Sam, what does that mean for Iran? Well, say that the Iranians ran the world. No, they don't. I'm talking about this world. But what if the ISIS ran the world? No, I'm not talking about.
I'm just talking about ideas.
Yeah, right. One of the ideas that I think has a lot of power to change the world is that dealing with reality is a great way to deal with reality. That's one of my ideas that I believe in.